Moving forward on the ideas of managing financial and macro-fiscal issues under climate change, we will look at a few more things, including financial instruments for dealing with the contingent liabilities that occur following a disaster. So you can see that I'm taking text here and there based on my own judgment of what's important, but you can read the whole report if you want further details. However, none of these instruments can meet all the needs on their own, so a combination of tools is preferable, which we will see in the next slide. Their values can be assessed in various dimensions. So we looked at this Global Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction and World Bank report, including financial costs and benefits. Different instruments have different costs for providing the same post-disaster $1. So these often depend on the amounts at stake. For example, transaction costs can make small portfolios inexpensive, but extremely large contracts are also expensive because the risk taker needs large and liquid financial reserve. Volume. Some instruments such as reserve funds are efficient when the amounts covered remain relatively small, but there are limits to the size of these funds, and opportunity costs can grow quickly, especially in countries with limited resources and large investment needs. Opportunity cost at a basic level is basically the cost you incur by taking option B instead of option A, and where you end up in terms of costs and benefits compared to where you would have ended up if you took option A. Timeliness. The speed with which an instrument can deliver post-disaster finance depends on the process and the size of product. Government reserve funds are the quickest since the money is readily available, and the use of soft triggers means that contingency funds can be dispersed in a matter of days. Indemnity-based insurance, when the payoff depends on losses, is the slowest as it requires lengthy damage assessment. Discipline. Some instruments like insurance require strict contracts that provide discipline in terms of when and how resources are available and can be used. Others, like reserve funds, are more difficult to protect from opportunistic behavior. So you set up a reserve fund for something, but let's say to deal with infrastructure road network, but some smart politician may grab it for doing something else to make his constituents happy. Insurance businesses are now facing higher and higher risks. Reinsurance companies are having to pay out more than they planned for, so insurance business itself also requires more in terms of being disciplined in estimating the risk and planning its own financial reserves as well. Figure 19, as promised, financing instruments to cover contingent liabilities from natural disaster. This is a basket of multiple tools. So we are going from short-term liquidity to long-term financing needs on this axis, and high-frequency, low-intensity hazard to low-frequency, high-intensity hazard. You can think of this in terms of those return periods we were looking at in the case of Fiji and its planning, for example. So what are the multiple tools you have on this scale? At the lower end, short-term liquidity, budgetary instruments, sovereign reserve funds, government reserves, and as risk begins to hazard begins to get higher intensity, contingent financing. So you have World Bank, International Development Bank, JICA, deferred drawdown options, contingent emergency response components, and IDA crisis response window. Okay, so various acronyms here. You can look up the table. Sovereign risk transfer at low frequency, high intensity. You have insurance, so including risk pools, derivatives, and catastrophe bonds. As you move towards long-term financing needs, still at the lower end of intensity, higher frequency climate hazards, you have contingent budget and budget allocation still being an important thing here. But going to long-term financing needs at low frequency, high intensity events, you have insurance of public assets like schools, hospitals, roads, etc. And post-crisis financing is needed in the middle for emergency lending by or multilateral financing. Okay. Comparing risk financing scale-up strategies in Ethiopia at different probabilities. What did I do there? I don't know. Okay. I jumped somehow. Okay. At different probabilities of occurrence, we are looking at average cost for multiple strategies, 1 to 5 year, 1 in 5 year cost and 1 in 30 year cost. So low frequency, high intensity and high frequency, low intensity, and low frequency, high intensity lingo that we used before. So the opportunity cost is estimated in some ways. So you can think of it as humanitarian response representing cost not covered by government tools that need to be covered by humanitarian actors or foreign aid in this case. So humanitarian response is a huge part here at various levels, and that's specific to Ethiopia, for example. Budget reallocations, insurance, and federal contingency budget. You can see in terms of opportunity cost, the federal contingency budget is relatively small. Insurance is also relatively small, but humanitarian response is quite massive. So obviously that depends on what kind of hazard you are dealing with. Obviously there's a lot of details here that you have to go back and read. So opportunity costs are basically comparing multiple strategies. So here it says that strategy A would have an opportunity cost of over $800 million. Strategy B has a very low opportunity cost, not even needing humanitarian response, whereas strategy C has again a high opportunity cost, needing federal contingency budget reallocation, and humanitarian aid. So just learn about the details if you want. Looking at another figure, core module of the post-disaster public finance management review, public finance management PFM, which I bumbled before. So this is from this paper here, legal and institutional foundations, translating to public financial management through budget appropriation, financial management control, and public procurement. Okay, so in terms of taking action, let me read off these things here. Sector level adaptation plans collected, harmonized, and costed, and an estimate of public adaptation spending needs to be produced for targets and indicators. Long-term plan to diversify tax revenues away from vulnerable sectors is approved to be prepared for this. Climate and disaster impacts included in debt sustainability assessment or financial sector assessment program. Share of tax revenues originating from high vulnerability sectors figured out. In terms of macro-fiscal risk assessment, can be a standalone analysis such as with the World Bank IMF climate change policy assessment, or embedded into other long-term macro-level assessments. At least 2 such assessments, both joint World Bank IMF initiatives, have already started to include climate considerations such as disaster and climate risks. Okay. Debt sustainability analysis, which can include macrofiscal risks of climate change impacts and mitigation and adaptation plans. Finance sector assessment program, which can include climate and disaster risks in the financial sector assessment, especially in stress testing exercises. Stress testing is basically to put the regular activities of the financial sector through perturbed risk profiles or perturbations in the operation to see how they do in terms of dealing with the stressors. Okay, oops. It is also important, it's also important to consider that GDP impacts do not fully capture the severity of climate change impacts and cannot be used directly in a cost-benefit analysis of climate policies. So you need to pay attention that you're making estimates that do not include many things. There are several issues around using usual economic aggregates and GDP in particular as the unique metric for climate change damages. I'm getting a phone call, so that was actually an important call. I stayed here a couple of minutes because I didn't know I started recording. It's the birthday of my dear goddaughter Ravenna, who called me from Avignon, Sainte Marie de la Mer. Lovely to talk to her. So continuing with this discussion here, it's also important to consider that GDP impacts do not fully capture the severity of climate change impacts and cannot be used directly in a cost-benefit analysis of climate policies. This is very critical to remember. There are lots of non-market goods which cannot be simply reduced to cost-benefit analysis. There are several issues around using usual economic aggregates, the GDP in particular, as the unique metric for climate change damages. Okay, GDP does not measure consumption or societal well-being. Disasters, hurricanes in particular, can increase GDP growth and reduce well-being if increased risk leads to more precautionary savings. So after a disaster, there may be more employment, more economic activities to reconstruct, recover, house repairs, etc., which may show up as a GDP growth, but actually people may have been left devastated. Increasing investment in and consumption of defensive expenditure, for example, by building dikes and using air conditioning, may increase GDP without increasing societal well-being as well. So you have warming increasing in countries like India. People have higher incomes, but they buy an AC even if they cannot afford it because it becomes a necessity instead of a luxury at this point. Long-term averages are not a good measure of the impact of repeated shocks. In the US, a small decrease in productivity across all regions and sectors or one Katrina-like disaster per year can lead to the same 1% loss of GDP. But the latter has a bigger impact on well-being as losses are concentrated on a small population and are long-lasting in terms of post-traumatic stresses and recovery problems they face. Finally, national or regional aggregates can miss impact on the poorest. A major impact on poor people is compatible with small impacts on GDP, because in most countries, poor people represent a tiny share of income and wealth. If climate change impacts are concentrated on the poor, then GDP may not be the appropriate measure and other metrics may be preferable. So here is a summary of investment needs and recurrent costs for Fiji's full adaptation plan. Here are the sectors: planned, new, total. We looked at this in the summary, so look at it again here. Housing and land use, I won't read all the numbers, but it's basically investment needs in Fijian dollars, millions. Housing and land use, hazard management, transport, energy, water, health and education, environment, agriculture, fisheries, social protection, with a grand total planned coming at around 4,200 million, new at over 5,000 million, and a total at almost a billion. No, that's $9 billion. Okay, so keep that in mind. In terms of impact of climate change on GDP and public debt in two emission scenarios, maybe I should leave this for the next podcast because this disrupted one, I have to see just how long it is now. Okay, see you in the next podcast.